Alright, hello everybody, this is A.W. Antonio Wolf, here to do a bit of a video critique of a video on dialectics. It's not very long, it's about 10 minutes, but we'll see how long this goes. Usually short things turn out to be very long whenever we do this. So here with me is my friend Rain, fellow Hegelian respecter, and a couple of others here joining us to listen and perhaps ask questions. As I said, the sync tube has a play pause. If anybody wants to specifically pause it, you can go ahead and pause it and comment or ask questions. But alright, let's get going.
Recall that it is the engine of world history. Spirit actualizes itself throughout the course of historical events. In the reading for today, we get a really interesting articulation of this, which is the idea that spirit does this, it serves as the engine of world history through self-estrangement, basically by alienating itself. Spirit stands in opposition to itself, presenting its own hindrance to itself, and it must overcome itself throughout the course of world history. This is weirdly paradoxical, right? Hegel talks about this on the bottom of 59 and on page 60. He says,
I don't like when people do this. Like, it just makes Hegel seem like really, really weird. I mean, ignoring the whole spooky metaphysics stuff. Like, it just comes off as just like this weird philosophy babble.
Yeah, it's nonsense.
It's like, spirit is the engine of world history. How does it do it? Self-estrangement. What the fuck does that mean? But I think she touches on dialectics sooner than later.
That spirit only makes itself into what it is implicitly. And yet the development of spirit is imminent within world history itself. So it's not as if spirit is sort of standing apart like an all-knowing God who has the course of history charted out in advance. It's not like that. It's actually this weird motion, this principle of creating something like the way that an oak tree starts off as a seed and it has everything that it needs in order to develop, right, under the right conditions. But we can't say that the seed itself is already the oak tree, right? It is the oak tree implicitly. Spirit's self-actualization is implicit within itself, but needs the course of human history through human activity and subjective will or passion to realize itself. The highest achievement of spirit is ultimately to know itself, Hegel says on page 75.
Actually, just something to say about what she said earlier, about how, it's not like there's a self-conscious God who's kind of plotted out history. And she's like, it's not really like that. Well, actually, yes and no. This is actually something interesting that Rain and I and a couple of others have been talking about for probably the last 3-4 months. Where I also used to believe what she says, and I've come to take a different position on that. Where there's a lot of places where Hegel basically says, no, it really is kind of that. Like, it's not a fatalistic thing, though. Like, people don't want to go that way because they're like, oh, well, if there is a self-conscious God, that there is a providence to history, explicitly, that somehow that destroys free will, that somehow that makes everything fatalistic. Not at all. There's complexities to that, in which there can be a plan, and the plan can be ongoing, and you're part of that plan. But the part of the plan is that you are supposed to be free. That does not mean, of course, that you can just decide anything. In Hegelian philosophy, freedom is not a capricious thing. So there's a certain way in which, in order for you to be free, or anyone in general to be free, there's a specific set of determinations which we can actually play out. So, for example, like here she's taking a view of this from like the philosophy of history. For history to have the end goal of the state of freedom or the state of right at the end, whatever that may be. People say that Hegel claims it's Prussia. Seems pretty ludicrous, even by Hegel's own views, that anyone could believe that he thought that Prussia was the end of history as such. Even in that kind of scenario, right? It's just there is something which history is actually tending towards, and that this is not just a happenstance thing. To switch from like that being explicit to something implicit doesn't save you from the theological problems that you usually might think you have. By switching that and say like, oh, it's not explicit, it's not already given, and saying, but it is implicit, is to miss out that in being implicit, it is already given. Yeah. What do you think on that, Rain?
No, I was trying to think of like a really dumb kind of just like a way to attempt to give someone like an intuitive sense for, I don't know, it'd be like if someone said to you that freedom is the truth, prove me wrong, and you're like, I gotta prove that guy wrong. But then you get caught in like a double bind or something, where it's like, wait, if I prove him wrong, then I must be free from him or something like that. But if I prove him right, and freedom is true, then I had to do that freely, kind of a thing. Like it's so the way in which it's like God has a plan, or like spirit kind of knows the conclusion. But at the same time, we're like somehow free and able to do as we will. It's like, well, if the conclusion is like this kind of inexorable thing, but the inexorable thing is the thing that lets you free in the first place, it kind of can't lose, and it kind of does have a plan. But at the same time, that plan is wide open, but it will go back to that point, kind of a thing. It's just like a way to try and give an intuitive sense for why it's like not the craziest thing on earth that Hegel can say these fairly paradoxical sort of things.
No, yeah, that's a problem in the end. Like they're all it's impossible to say any of this without a paradox. Insofar as one thinks they get out of that paradox, they only fall back in. Which is what I bring up. Like, she thinks she's getting out of these things she doesn't want to be committed to, or at least she doesn't want to like make people think Hegel's committed to, by saying, oh, it's really just, it's about the implicit, just like the seed. The oak is in the seed, in the acorn. But the acorn, in being the acorn, is already destined then to be the oak. That if the conditions are right, as they should be, then the seed, the acorn, will become the oak, as it should be. And all of that is already fully immanent in that acorn. Like, it's already given there. It's just waiting for the actual conditions which will enable it to become what it ought to be already. So this destiny, like, is open. There's a lot of contingencies that can come about. But the thing which is navigating those conditions itself is already given fully.
Yeah, like even the way in which it could fail to achieve its oakhood, or its fully grown oak tree. That's already defined by its nature as an oak tree. Like, if you're a seed that needs to become an oak, what it means to become an oak is you need this much water, you need this much sunlight, you need this kind of temperature, you need this bacteria in the soil, this microbiome, all these other things. the way in which you'll deform and die and come to ruin, it's already defined. But at the same time, it's defined such that it's dependent upon other conditions that surround it. Like, it defines itself such that it depends on another. And so on. But that is its own determinacy. Like, nothing else made it that.
Yeah, and with humans, I mean, that's just infinitely more radical, where, you know, naturally speaking, yes, we're beholden to other physical conditions. We need to eat, we need shelter, we need all these other things. But as thinking beings, we aren't. And, you know, as thinking beings, what society and what we are in society is entirely determined by what we think of ourselves, ultimately. And there is no given natural determination to that. And yet, there is also a given nature to thought, in a way, in that, you know, just like there's an objectivity to thought. There's a certain way in which, just like, you know, in the phenomenology or science of logic, you know, sense certainty has objective structures and movements that when you actually think it as it is, you can only go in one way. The same thing with the science of logic. You can only think, if you think being truly as it is, you can only think it one way. There's actually not this radical open contingency at all. You know, insofar as it may appear to be, it's just like there's external factors coming in. But, you know, people who might would appeal to this, like, well, you know, there's those external factors. That's not freedom either. You know, it's kind of the opposite of what you want. So, anyways, the point about that is, yeah, go ahead.
Just to defend her a little bit, I'm just already getting the impression that I don't know. I haven't checked out her videos, but I suspect she does a lot of different videos. Like, even in the recommended bar while it's paused, it's got like Schopenhauer, Marx and Engels, Hegel, and stuff. That's like tons of, like, you know, people spend their whole lives reading Marx. People spend their whole lives reading Hegel. I suspect she's consulting with like people who she trusts or knows or who otherwise are more experienced in Hegel, and running drafts past them and stuff like that. And so, like, when she's saying a lot of this stuff, I think part of it's like taking it on good faith from other scholars, perhaps. So I wouldn't.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd want to be careful about trying to characterize her as like.
No, she's not. She's not like one of those people who like make those like awful videos of, you know, the Hegelian dialectic conspiracy stuff. Not at all. I mean,
yeah.
She is I think she's a professor. I don't know.
Yeah, I think she's trying to be a good scholar, and she's like trusting her good resources.
So, you know, like, this isn't some kind of crazy interpretation of Hegel. It's just a common interpretation in many ways. It's better. It's actually, looking at her other videos, it's better than the common interpretation. It's just like, you know, because they don't have the specialization of, like, you know, putting the actual focus on the direct study. There's just stuff that they wouldn't be aware of.
Yeah.
You know, she used the word weird. Like, I think she's having a weird reading of Hegel. Probably, I'm no expert on Hegel. I think she's having a weird reading of Hegel because she, like, presupposed that this should be weird in some sense. So.
No, I don't think so. Like, it's not a weird interpretation. It's actually very common. It's just that it's not false. It's the kind of, the weirdness of it is that it's not false. It's just like presented in a certain way, it comes off as being much weirder than it actually is. But then after you go into it, like, to a certain extent, it is much weirder than you think it is.
Yeah, it is weird, but I don't know. It seems kind of religious to me the way she talks about it. You know, like.
Yeah, but you have to, like, this was a common interpretation. It's not common now anymore. but most people aren't like up to date like what's going on now. Like people like Holgate, Winfield, even people like Zizek and what. Those people are like current day specialists, and like only specialists consult them. Like the general person who isn't a specialist in this doesn't actually know about these people by and large.
Yeah. And like she should know, because like just reading Hegel without like today's context would be, I don't know if it's right in Farsi that I speak, it's we say it this way, that it's hermeneutically wrong, incorrect kind of, because uh like what Hegel means for a man today is how a man today reads Hegel or any other philosophy. So like there are great people like Zizek, for example, that have read Hegel and reinterpreted it. And to see what Hegel says, you have to see how it is read now, not before. So yeah,
Even then,
I
like
guess that's
you're
all.
gonna
Yeah,
make mistakes.
yeah, of course you're mistakes in what sense? You can know what you know. You can read the stuff the way you read the stuff. You can't do
Right, like
some
the only
other
way you would
way.
like find out like what is actually correct is like you'd have to like hit the direct stuff, and that's the main reason why presentations like this like miss stuff out, because admittedly like when you're a professor you don't have all the time in the world, especially it seems like she's definitely just starting out in her or very early in her career. She's still got a long way to go. So in those portions, like a lot of these people teach things which they're not experts in, but they're teaching like these lower level introductory classes, and they're making the best of what they can. That said, I do wish that there would be more conscious care about such things, especially with like Marx and Hegel are definitely the two that I know for sure like suffer immensely because of this, because they're two thinkers in which they are not amenable to piecemeal and secondary readings. You have to read them directly to find out what it's all about. Otherwise, you can read a lot of stuff. You can read a lot of stuff that's even up to date. That's just going to lead you astray, and you just wouldn't know any better because you haven't done the work. And I can understand why people wouldn't want to do the work. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot with Hegel. It's a lot with Marx. It's not like, say, like Schopenhauer. Like there's just no way to give any piecemeal like, oh, here's what this like argument is. Here's what this concept is. It's just not doable. But unless you've done it, you don't realize that it isn't doable either. You know what I mean? So like it's a problem of like you don't know what you don't know. And what Raymond's saying is like, they have to take it on faith.
Yeah. But you have to know stuff to be able to read something old, Marx, Hegel, or any other philosopher, to be able to read it and talk about it with, like your colleagues, people today, like you have some sort of background when you read Hegel, like it's not like you're reading Hegel directly again, like you're not in a vacuum when you read Hegel, directly even. So I guess you should actually read like the secondary stuff, like not even the secondary stuff, the consequences, like of Hegelian philosophy, to actually be able to read it and communicate it, like talk about it. Because if you're not able to communicate it to other people, it's just like I don't know how meaningful it can be even. So yeah.
Yeah. Some philosophers are just really tricky where the things they were saying are not they're not things that are even commonplace. Like, there are plenty of things in philosophy that you can read, and you can, if you're like paying attention to it and, you know, giving a little effort, you'll be able to walk away and be like, I can articulate that idea. Because they're ideas that are just common parlance. They're just part of your day-to-day almost. And it's just a matter of like, okay, they reminded me of that thing, and they pointed out that, you know, there's a distinction there, and that's like an important thing. And it's just, you know, it's just like pulling out distinctions that are already kind of there. Whereas some philosophers, you will have to, they will make you notice something that was barely present in your day-to-day, but if you really, really think about it, and you dig and you press, you'll be like, oh my god, that is a distinction I didn't even know about. Like, genuinely, I didn't know about this distinction, but it was totally there all along, kind of stuff. And working through it can be a whole extra thing. And some philosophers are really challenging like that, and it honestly just takes a lot of time, and it takes faith. Like, you have, because they'll be saying something that will sound, when you read it, you'll be like, it will be unintuitive. Exactly, because it's kind of like a radical rethinking of something. Like, you're genuinely challenging your common sense almost. And you kind of have to have some faith that, like, you know, I trust that this person's not an idiot. I'm betting they're actually brilliant. I'm just going to give them that chance. And I should doubt myself before I doubt them. And I'm just going to try and push my way through to try and make sense of what they're saying, because that is not intuitive. And if somebody else said that, I'd dismiss it. But for the really good ones, when you break through, you'll be like, oh my god, they were right. Or like, that is true. Or that makes a lot of sense, and I would not have thought that if I didn't, like, have a little trust here and push through. And I don't know, Hegel's among those kinds of philosophers that it's just like, it's hard to do a cursory summary at all, because it just won't work. It just doesn't work. You'll sound like babble or gobbledygook.
Yeah. Like, for example, like just in this beginning where she mentions, okay, spirit is the engine of world history. The words are right there in Hegel, like, you know, almost verbatim. But like, what the hell that means is so important that saying it that way makes it seem a lot weirder than it actually is. Because, you know, like, it's a duality of the meaning of spirit in German, where spirit, Geist, bis Mos, what we think of as spirit and mind. It's just a regular word, which is ambiguous in German. If you set what she said and then like change it from spirit to mind and take away that theological emphasis, which is not wrong, but which in our milieu today is immediately misleading, because it's loaded with a lot of things people will presume, unfortunately. But if you change it to mind, it makes it a bit easier. Still, you know, however, like, it's still loaded with presuppositions that people have about, like, oh, this is just ideals and blah blah blah. Yeah, if you then if you rephrase that like to freedom, it becomes a lot clearer. It becomes a lot easier to communicate what's going on, because spirit mind is freedom. It's just a different, you know, the change of the term name is a different emphasis on the kind of weight you want to give it towards a certain interpretation, and all the interpretations are concurrent with each other. They're not separately equal, but like they all form together, you know, under, like, once you understand what spirit really means, you understand it is mind, you understand it is God, you understand it is freedom, and you understand how those things all interrelate and share the same singular form as a concrete universal. So, you know, she says, like, well, you know, freedom is the engine of history. and you give it just a little bit of qualification as to what do you mean, it starts making a hell of a lot of sense. How is freedom the engine of history? Well, what is it that history is? Hegel tells us. Hegel says, one, we only have a notion of history because we're at the end of history. Histories are only retroactive. You don't know that something is a history until whatever that was the history of is concluded in the thing that it was going to conclude in. Certain discoveries, for example, combustion engines and all that other jazz, are the histories of cars only when cars are things that exist. And then retroactively say, this is the history of the car. So, for history as such for Hegel is just the history of freedom. So then to say, well, freedom is the engine of history is to say nothing other than freedom is the engine of freedom, which is a tautology. But when you actually think about it, because for Hegel, it's the process and the end are not distinct things separate from each other, but are themselves one singular process and end, which is both process and end at both sides. So, at the beginning of history, it's not unfreedom as opposed to the end of history where there is freedom. It's not an on-off switch. There's been freedom all along the way. And the very way in which you go from the beginning to the end is itself a process of freedom being free. And in being free, becoming more and more free until, it's absolutely free, in which then it's capital T truth free. So yeah, that's kind of the issue with not being acquainted enough with the scholarship on this stuff, which is forgivable on an individual basis. I see no problems with any singular philosopher or self-described philosopher, professor or anything that just doesn't know their Hegel, because they're not a Hegel specialist. They're not into Hegel. That's fine. But I do think there is a bit of responsibility that if you decide, well, I'm going to make videos to teach people about this stuff, you ought to put a little bit more effort into that.
I should even write a book. Occasionally someone will write a whole fucking book.
But anyways, let's continue on.
Spirit wants to be self-conscious of itself by taking itself as its own object. And it can only do so through thinking itself. So spirit's movement is this process of externalizing itself in different formations.
So okay, just now this I do think is wrong. This thing saying that it wants something. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense either in a theological sense, oh, God wants this, because a want is correlated with a need. It wouldn't make sense to say God needs anything, because then it wouldn't be God. And in this case, indeed, it's not that there is this unconscious thing, or even a conscious thing that wants anything. It's just what it does, but it is what it is, not in a mechanical way. The example of a tree is a pretty good one, or a plant in general. The plant needs nutrients, so the organism is determined in such a way that it'll grow roots, and the roots will penetrate into the earth to get those nutrients. To say that the plant wants nutrients is just giving too much to it. Now, obviously, free beings want freedom, but their want is not a want just of something else. It's also just the want itself is freedom itself. The process of freedom, which draws higher and higher more concrete forms of freedom into reality by, it's just like in no mysterious way. We want, it's like if I want food, I just get up and go to my fridge, go to my kitchen, make something. We want freedom. Well, what do? Well, we make societies, and this is just kind of a wrong way to put it, because, this is kind of the atomic view of like, oh, well, there were individuals and then there was society. No, we are already born as social beings. Whether ever there was a point in which we weren't social beings and somehow we became social beings is irrelevant. As the beings that we are social beings. We are beings who are free. We're primed for freedom. Even when we are misshapen by conditions of society, history, nature, our freedom still shines through. And it's just that total process, which includes desires, but isn't reducible to being motivated by a desire. I don't know if I'm making sense with it.
I know what you mean by to want is itself an end, where basically, it's an ends in itself sort of thing. There's no middle term of the means to the ends. The ends and the ends just conclude, and that's what posits a means, almost as an in-between.
Yeah, it's just it's a paradox. It's impossible to say it otherwise. Freedom desires freedom, and freedom is a means to itself, and itself is its own end.
Yeah, for I don't know. There's certain aspects of Hegel that very much coincide with what you could call mysticism or mystical traditions. But some of those sorts of things like that are ones that are very, very commensurate with those sorts of traditions.
I suppose the only other point I would bring up here is the problem of setting this up as a want or a need makes it seem like the world is instrumental. But the world itself, or nature, is also its own end. And Hegel makes this clear. It's not that while spirit or mind does ultimately reveal itself to be the origin and positor of nature, and that in a certain way nature is instrumental, there's also a way in which nature clearly isn't, in which nature is not there as our momentary means for anything. It exists. It's weird to say for itself because it's not conscious, but it does exist independently of any subjective mind of ours. Whether we as thinking beings exist on Earth, the entire ecology of Earth, suppose absent us but remaining everything else, all the same, would nonetheless still be chugging along. Life would still be happening, physics would still be going, nature would still be naturing.
Yeah, so the way I see it is sort of as far as I can tell for Hegel, nature, what nature actually is the emergence of spirit. Nature in itself is all it can do, tries to do, and is to become spirit. Spirit is what posits itself as nature and knows itself as not nature. So, all spirit, all nature does is become spirit. All spirit does is posit itself as nature and return to itself. it's sort of two sides of the same coin.
Another way to put it is just like, this is just the weirdness of the relationship of logic as logos to nature, right? In which like people think that transition is very mysterious, and they're like, well, and the way that it's framed, a lot of people want to frame it as a relationship necessity, but Hegel himself warns that it should not be taken as that. There is no sense in which logic needs to posit nature. It just does. And the way that I make sense of that is that nature is the free existence of logos, like where it is one instance of what it means to be at all. It's not beyond logos, it's actually within it, really. When people think about it, people have a misunderstanding of the relationship between logic and nature and spirit. It's the whole thing about the three syllogisms at the end of the encyclopedia, where Hegel himself talks about the three different ways the syllogism of the system could be arranged between nature, spirit, and logic. Where, for thought to be, one of those ways to be is just this pure abstraction of, thought. But out of that pure abstraction, within that abstraction itself, there is the determining power which allows it to be. Well, it has the freedom to be otherwise. And that's what nature is. So it's just... And in the end, the understanding of what logos is, what the idea is the understanding that there's the quote-unquote logical idea, which is merely the concept of the idea. And then there's the natural idea, quote-unquote, which is the objective side of that. And then there's the absolute idea, which is the actual recognition of that. Those two sides are just two determinations of the exact same thing. And that they're free determinations. They're not impositions by anything else. And they're not things that have a necessary connection of the kind that people think of as, they're like, well, logos as logos is like fully self-determining and transparent to itself. That's precisely why it alone is absolute and free. But anyways, that's just getting into a whole circle of a mess of interpretive issues. I suppose we should move on.
Reflect, and then sort of overcoming that formation, that relationship, and creating a new reflection. This is what's known as dialectic. Hegel is known for a dialectical method of philosophy. And so what I've been saying so far is sort of challenging to grasp, understandable. Hegel is famously difficult to grasp. So let me give you a useful heuristic that a lot of people use while teaching Hegel, but with the caveat that this particular schema is somewhat oversimplified and you're not going to find it that often in Hegel himself. This is the schema of dialectics known as the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. According to Hegel, history is driven by opposites. You have a thesis, A, an antithesis, B, and those things are mutually incompatible. What happens is that because of that incompatibility, a tension arises that ultimately leads to the collapse of that opposition. But when that opposition collapses, it's not as if the thesis and antithesis just fall away. Rather, their moment of collapse is sort of preserved at a higher level, which is the synthesis, the Aufhebung in German, or the sublation. This word sublation basically implies that something is superseded, it's moved beyond, but it's preserved at the same time. So for Hegel, all of the past moments and oppositions of world history are in a sense present in the present moment, but they are present as having been superseded. So an example that Hegel gives is in terms of structures of government.
So if she knew this was wrong, I don't know why she put it forth. Because I don't know, like, I've never found that helpful. I don't think that's ever helped anybody. Like, that never clarified anything. And it's just a wrong metaphor. That's the best you can say about it. It's a metaphor.
I'm just a little surprised to actually hear that in the video. Because I don't know, I thought at this point it was like famously wrong. Like the thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing. I thought that was like a thing that was like for a while thought, but I thought, I don't know, it felt like maybe the past 40 years or something, people got that was at least just through hearsay, oh no, Hegel wasn't thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That was somebody else, and it got misattributed, popularized.
Yeah. Like
I thought at this point that was just like a famously don't say that. Like, not even like you have to understand why you don't say it. You just know you don't say it.
Exactly, and everybody, it's just so weird, right? Everybody does know it. They admit it. They're like, it's not really this way, and yet they still go ahead and do it. I think the main reason is because it is just so tempting. Because this is like the only formulation that most people are aware of that seems to have any intelligibility at all. Aside from that, like they just get lost. You know, if you go and read Hegel and you get the what is it? Abstract, negative, concrete. The hell does that mean? Even if you read the actual like passages where he's trying to explain to you what that means, there's no way you're gonna get it. Like it's just too weird. It already assumes it's only intelligible after the fact that you have kind of gotten the hang of doing it, and then you can recognize it. So I think that's why the allure remains, that even though people know it's wrong, they want something positive to hold on to, because otherwise they probably feel like they can't grab onto anything. You know, it's one of the few things.
You know, that might actually be true. Like, I don't know, people like Bertrand Russell are like miserable at understanding Hegel, like zero effort. And yet there was a serious period of time where just him and a few other people, just some of the things they said based on virtually nothing, massively influenced what people what people thought of and accepted regarding interpreting Hegel. And so it's like there's got to be a convenience aspect to it at some level, right?
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's something that in a few instances it seems to fit, but it is so hard, like, if you actually understand those passages, like, to actually give it that. Like, the main thing is, like, the thesis antithesis model is already, like, you know, and Hegel's the one who even says it. He says, like, the reason not to use this is this makes it seem as if the opposition is external, as if you have this thing against that thing. And it's not the case that that's what happens. What a dialectic is not that here's A and here's B, and then, you know, they come into conflict, there's tension, and then here's C, which comes in and resolves this tension. It's a complete misunderstanding. It's rather, here's A. When A plays itself out, it turns out to be B. When B plays itself out, it turns out to be A. And the dialectic is precisely that aspect in which every single thing, which, you know, the understanding is it takes to be a given self-identical unity, completely subverts itself. There's nothing you can hold on to. You know, when you actually abstract things into proper, like, philosophical thinking, and you play those things out, everything falls away. You know, like Marx's famous phrase, all that is solid melts into air. Literally. Like, there is no ground for the understanding. Like, the dialectic is precisely that, the ever-shifting of the categories or the concepts, where they become, this is what the meaning of self-othering is. This is what self-alienation is. It's the fact that, in a thing being what it is, it has to be something else, and that something else is what the opposite is determined as. In an acorn, actually being an acorn, it cannot possibly remain an acorn, because to be an acorn is to be that thing which is going to become an oak. And likewise, there's a certain sense in which the oak has to become an acorn. It's a weird way to phrase it, because a bunch of people are like, the oaks don't become acorns. They make acorns, but they don't become an acorn. It's a technicality. But there's a certain sense in which logically it makes sense to say the oak has become an acorn, and it starts the whole system anew. That's what the dialectic is. And then these whole sublation things.
Yeah, that's so tricky on them. You'd be like, well, how'd you get the fucking oak then? From an acorn. How'd you get the acorn from an oak?
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
Yes, actually, both.
Yeah, and that's exactly what sublation is. She says it's attention. It's not really attention at all. There is no, the actual process it's a very fluid, and it's not attention that does anything. It's the opposite. It's just a superfluidity in thought. You cannot hold these thoughts stable. They constantly slip into each other, and it's the recognition of that which is what sublation is. Once you realize, it's not either acorn or an oak, it's the acorn and the oak, but this is not two things that I brought together externally. It's two things that I've already seen for myself before my very eyes, both of perception and of thought, that I have seen that this thing does become the other, and back again. And in grasping, it's one thing. In fact, that's what reason is. That's what sublation is. Now, I don't know why that's so difficult for people to grasp. I can only assume that indeed this just isn't common. This isn't knowledge that's easily accessible to somebody who isn't already aware of it. I'm not surprised by that. It's like what I said earlier. There's a certain sense which, unfortunately, this whole thing, everybody knows this is wrong. Yes. But the only people who know what's right are the people who are really specialized. And even then, within the people who are certified by academia as being specialized, you and I know that a lot of them don't understand almost anything. And so then these people are also just the vast majority of people out there who are, making friends, hey, here's my Hegelian colleague who doesn't know anything, a certain somebody on Twitter.
Yeah, no, I continually puzzle myself day on day trying to figure out what people who end up reading Hegel but still saying just incorrect things, just really incorrect things that are... It's confusing that you'd say them assuming you're reading the text, even naively, right? Don't have some fancy take on it. Just take some of the things he says even at face value, and it's really hard to support that reading, because he'll say things that are just, don't try and smart your way out of it, just kind of accept that he's going there. And it's extremely hard to justify a lot of quite popular at the current moment readings on the basis of just what Hegel says. There's subtleties in these conversations, but there's a lot of people saying that no, Hegel is a post-Kantian thinker He accepts the restrictions, in some sense, that Kant laid out, that barred us from the traditional metaphysics, freed us from the traditional metaphysics and stuff like that. But then you get to, like, you just look in the Encyclopedia Logic, and Hegel's talking about the concept, and he's like, do not think that this is just the concept, or the concept of anything is just something that we've applied or formulated ourselves and like applied to the thing. He says, no, this is the things are this. They are it. And your thinking is it. Like, don't think that you thought it and that got it there, or don't think that you just passively received it or something. It's just what they are. And just that, like, there's certain points where he strains this kind of, like, substantiality of, like, the concept, or the judgment. Like, he doesn't even frame the judgment like, here's what you have to do when you think logically or something like that. Or, like, here's what I'm doing when I'm abstractly formulating judgments in my head. He never talks about it like that. He says a plant coming from a seed and, like, growing into a plant, like a literal plant. If you go to your yard and look at a dandelion, he says a seed becoming a plant is literally a judgment.
Yep.
What can we think he's fucking talking about when he says shit like that? Where is our Kantian, our post-Kantian thing go? How do you interpret that as a post-Kantian statement where you think, yeah, my literal logical judgment, the very form of logic itself, a plant does that when it becomes a seed, like when a seed sprouts. What do we think we're talking about at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I don't get how people have those views. Like cognitivist versions of Hegel are just so weird. Just like, like logical reductions either. I just don't get it. Because Hegel just straight out says it. This is not the thing. This isn't, because he makes this distinction, right? And like, this is an important distinction. He says, there's a way in which concepts can be misunderstood as representations. And he says, what I'm talking about is the representation in your head, because, there is a way in which, like, depending on what you're talking about, a concept will be include a representation. Will not be it, but will include it. Sure, fine. It is that representation in your head, but it's also the thing itself. It says, like, when I talk about being, I'm not just talking about this cognitive concept in your mind. I'm also talking about being. That being. Being as such. What everybody thinks, like, oh, being is the beingness of things. That's exactly what he's talking about. Doesn't get limited to what people think that being is, being as such, but it does include that. So yeah, that and other people who are like, what is it, the Pippians, who are obsessed with the whole transcendental unity of apperception and saying, like, it's all about the it's the transcendental unity of apperception that they're obsessed with. So they think that's why the judgments are important, and that they take that one line, which isn't even relevant to that one, the quote, that the passage that it's quoted in, where he says, like, the I, is a self-consciousness, the concept is what is it? You even had the quote, like, it's the concept in the concept as self-consciousness, which is like a unique tell in that one to me. It's like, there's a distinction with the concept as concept and the concept as consciousness, and they're like, there you go. He said this thing. It's actually, the concept is consciousness, is self-consciousness. Therefore, everything hinges upon the cognitive thinker. This is all really just a transcendental logic, a la Kant, where this is just about the structures of the mind, but it's not just our human mind, it's all minds. All minds have to be this way, but the world appears according to the mind. It's just a bizarre thing. But anyways, long digression. Let's move on.
Talks about despotic monarchy, where one person is ruling, as being a kind of thesis. That's a first moment of state formation. And then that despotic monarchy gets opposed by a different kind of government, which is democracy, where the people are ruling rather than one person ruling. So we have this opposition between monarchy and democracy. But monarchy and democracy not only are in tension with each other, but they're also internally in tension, according to Hegel. Monarchy is in tension with itself because it relies on the obedience of the people, but it doesn't give the people a voice. And he says that democracy is in tension with itself because by letting people rule themselves, passion and caprice run free. They're not appropriately guided by reason. So we have a thesis of despotic monarchy and an antithesis of democracy, and Hegel says that these collapse because they're both in tension with themselves and in tension with each other and lead to constitutional monarchy, which is basically Hegel's ideal of government. Here he thinks we have the rule of the people through a constitution, but then we also have a single person ruling who is paradoxically, by virtue of being an individual, representing everybody, and that's the monarch. This is far from the only example of a thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure, but it is one that comes up in the reading for today. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to Marx as well. Hegel summarizes his dialectical view on...
Can't say anything about that because I actually haven't finished the philosophy of history. I think you and I agree that it's horrible, right?
But I've actually got my philosophy of right in front of me right now, and there's a very brief section where he discusses what he regards as the phases of development. Anyways, her example was inconvenient regarding, especially that particular point for Hegel at least, because it's not like, oh, I've got monarchy on one side and I've got democracy on one side. From what I remember, it's 4. There's roughly 4 phases Hegel identifies, and indeed, the first one is, it's not even monarchy necessarily, but it's like, yeah,
it's tyranny. Yeah, despotism, tyranny.
Yeah, and the point, I think, that makes it so, for Hegel, makes it so, just absurd, like, it's ridiculous, is not even the king's the king, because he compares it to almost like a nature worship, where the king doesn't even obey, like, the laws come from basically nowhere. They're just there, and even the king's subordinated to just the laws, like, that are from nowhere. Like, they have no basis at all. It's just nature, right? It's just a natural order, so to speak. People do this, and even the king just doesn't even get it.
Which is kind of the irony, right? Like, the usual phrase people say, like, in tyranny, only one is free. Aristocracy, only some are free. And it's not actually with constitutional monarchy that all are free. Like, it's well, no, like, it is with constitutional monarchy, but the root of it is actually in Christianity, where it says, with Christianity, we come to know that all ought to be free.
Yes, that's one of the most fascinating, or I don't know if you want to call it funny or curious, but is the way in which that shit beginning for Hegel is the conclusion, insofar as we are self-conscious of it, where for him democracy is like a third stage. So for him it's like, from what I remember, it's like you've got this just insane hierarchy that just doesn't even make sense to begin with. Like, nobody knows why the hierarchy is that way. Then it goes to, why is this hierarchy this way? And we get this transition to subjectivity. Like you're questioning it at that point, and that transitions into democracy eventually. I forget the exact characterization of that second phase, but then you get a kind of democratic spirit from that, where it's like, this has to make sense for me. But the way in which it ultimately makes sense for every individual person, insofar as we're thinking about it, is a monarchy for Hegel. Like, Hegel is a monarchist, because it doesn't make sense for everybody to have just like my personal willing. That's just incompatible insofar as let's say everybody's will individually is legitimate. Well, my will can't just be personal, because then that universality of all our mutual willings is illegitimate. So, like, what it means to agree is to actually be able to have a leader, in a sense, for Hegel. If you can't figure out a leader, it means none of you fucking agree. Like, I don't know, there's like those there's a common sentiment now, and I think Joe Rogan's a good figure for this, which is like, what are we, like monkeys? We need like a leader? Like, what are we, like apes? Like, you need a leader? Why don't we, like, are we all just like, and it's like, because we are equals, that's exactly why we can figure out who a leader is. Like, that's exactly what it means to set aside all your personal bullshit and be like, no, we need to agree, and that's what makes sense. And so, even though there's going to be things I don't agree with, ultimately, it doesn't even make sense for me to destroy our whole social fabric just because I have issues. This needs to work for everyone. Everyone's going to lose on some level. And part of setting yourself aside is figuring out a way to converge on something. And part of that's getting a leader, and that's a monarchy.
Yeah, there's various nuances.
It's like the beginning, but everybody knows what they're doing now. It's the interim from that despotic standpoint to figuring out what the hell we're even doing, that kind of returns you to that standpoint, but you do it self-consciously so that you're not even you're not subordinated anymore. Again, this is I think important regarding contemporary interpretations of Hegel, and seeing how substance becomes concept, where it's not that substance is insubstantial, it's that substance, as efficacious, as self-realizing, absolutely enters into its accidents. And so the accidents themselves, as accidents, as the negative of the negative, as the negative that is negative, as finite, is the indwelling of substance. So that insofar as what is finite recognizes itself as finite, it is substantial. That's how you become substantial, is by purging that I am just me, my personal self. I am me, my little bounded world, or me and my personal opinions. That's bullshit. Me as an individual is bullshit. I am truly universal. That's how the universal comes to actually individuate itself and become present individually and be conscious of itself. Conscious in the sense that Hegel means, where consciousness is, I have an external object before me, where it's like, there's like a double sense here, where it's like, I'm looking at myself as an individual. So I'm almost like consciousness of an individual, but at the same time, I am that individual, and that consciousness is of something outside of me. Substance, or like the substantial being of my society, my state, or the world history. So it's at once world history, this gigantic object before you, but at the same time, that thing is the same thing that's looking at you as an individual in it. And that's how you sublate your finitude, your individuality, whereby you are actually elevated, like you are actually like transcendently present as a finite individual that is an actualization and realization of the substance. You take up the work of substance, and you are continuous with yourself as an individual through substance. And that's how substance comes to be itself. That's how you would say God can see himself in religious language for Hegel, which he thinks is contentful, genuinely speculative, is just representational, because it's not like you ran through the science of logic or some shit like that and now you know exactly how to use your words. No, you need representations, and you use the language of your times, the religion that is present to you, because religion is the very form through which, or the thing through which we harness a relationship to something that absolute, and come to feel the indwelling presence of absolute spirit in ourselves. Spirit witnesses spirit. So the transition to the concept from substance is that it's the self-realization of substance. It is the indwelling of substance infinitude, such that it can return to itself. And then once we're in the concept, that's what the concept is. The concept is just the process of how that works. But people just see it. It's like you ditch Spinoza, and now we just have individuals or something like that. It's like, no! The way in which you are an individual is through the universal. It's the return of the universal to itself as individual. And that's why he's always frames it as like two-sided, like the finite and the infinite. Like he goes back and forth on this because anyways, I'm rambling at this point.
But very, very fascinating points for those who can follow along. I'd say that the way I would further refine what you're saying for the listeners who aren't so specialized is this whole thing, like, the substance becoming concept, becoming subject. And the substance would be just the universal. I mean, it's in the name. It's the universal given substance. That would just be like, like in the formative state, that would be the institutions. That would be, the Constitution, written, and as well as the actual constitution of the government bodies, legislative, executive, etc. All of those are substantial. The ways in which you just have cultural habits. Americans are a certain way, and that's just part of what it quite literally substance is. It's just what it is to be an American. If you are raised in America, you're gonna be that way, whether you like it or not. It is what literally informs you. And then how that becomes a subject is precisely in the awareness that someone has in raising themselves. What you said about, like, it's you stand back from yourself as a singular individual, and in standing back from yourself and thinking about yourself in broader roles, there's me as just the immediate body, my immediate desires and whatnot, but I live in a family, and so I stand back and I think about myself as family, not just as myself as like I'm me in a family or me in my family. I am that family too, and insofar as I step back from myself and think from the standpoint, like, okay, like, this is what I want, but what would actually be the good for my family, because I am that family to the extent that I am part of that family as well. In standing back, I take the standpoint of the family, and in making judgments about what shall I do in relationship to my family, it's the family making judgments about me, doing things in relation to my family, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then you stand back at further and further and broader forms of life. Then there's your community, there's your local church, your school, religion, your local party, politics, whatever it is. Each one of those, like, literally are universals. They're not just abstractions in your head. They are actual unities in the world, and they're not abstract unities. These are unities that are generating parts of reality itself. To be religious is not simply just like to have a private little world inside your head of like, oh, I believe in God and have a sense of God. People form communities around this. People make laws around this. People live their lives around this, whether there are like state laws or not. These are things in the world. Like they're universals that are interacting with other universals as well. And so to stand back and say, like, this is what I might desire, but according to religion, then that's religious consciousness. And it's not just my consciousness, it's literally the consciousness of the religion itself through me. So yeah, that's a very good point you made. Actually, I hadn't thought about it in that kind of framing. It's a very intuitive one, actually, once you suss it out.
Yeah, and I think the double sense of that standing back, like almost like sitting behind your head, like looking at myself through the frame of this thing. But at the same time, it's important to frame this in terms of consciousness, where it's like, because this is where people get caught up. It's like the most alienating point, but at the same time, it is the connection, which is like that standing back and looking at myself from the standpoint of the state. But at the same time, it's like, go walk around, go look around. There's houses, there's people, there's buildings, there's government buildings, and it like, go look at a map of the globe. You can see your whole country, and you could watch a war on you. You can see it. It's doing it. Like, it's not just you sitting there in your chair abstracting backwards. It's literally deepening itself in front of you as well. It's both. It's like a simplicity. It's like this simplicity on both sides that is just identical. There's no difference between them, but they appear differently, and that contradiction is, consciousness, self-consciousness. This appearance of an in itself, and like me and my limit of my phenomenal experience, it's on both ends, and it's the difference, which isn't a difference between them, is the thing. It's just generating what it's like to be you there as a particular person.
Yeah, like that point about it's you can't confuse that, then like this thing depends on me. It's the inverse. You depend on it. That you can stand back and see from its standpoint doesn't mean that its standpoint is fully determined by you, the individual. There's hundreds of millions of individuals. Some of those individuals full time take that standpoint of consciousness and execute its operations, and even they aren't exactly aware entirely of what's going on in that level of reality. But that level of reality is actually there. The state, as a state, and Hegel actually says it, like, the state as a state has, as it were, its own will, independent of any finite individual will. There are certain necessities to the state which are objectively there and which will be actively engaged just because it is a state. And certain individuals at any one time can stand back and gain the view of the state. But even if they don't, the state is there. And that's the same way for God. That's kind of the weirdness of it, where people don't want to go there often. It's like they're like, and that's like one of the things that the Neo-Kantians definitely tend to like, because they don't want to. A lot of them are very openly atheists, and so they don't want to take any objective view of this, because there's the implication there that God would be real.
Yeah. It's interesting because Hegel provides examples that are very easy to make sense of from just a common sense standpoint regarding things like Providence, where it's like you take somebody who, I don't know, let's say somebody had a bad fight in their relationship and they want revenge. And so what they do is they light that person's house on fire. And that fire, so their intention, what they meant, what they quote unquote willed, what they meant, what they wanted to do, what they sought, their desire, was to punish their partner and burn their house. But it spread a fire throughout the whole neighborhood, and ambulances had to come, police sirens, everything. It cost dollars, and the whole community had to do fundraisers afterwards and stuff to try and repair damages and all this stuff. That wasn't what they meant. That was what they wanted, but it was the truth. And when Hegel talks about the actual will, the will, he doesn't mean what you want. He doesn't mean what you meant. He means what truly, just in virtue of the thing, the intention and the act, the fact that you acted in this way, was intrinsically more interconnected than you might have anticipated. And there's a sense in which that's kind of how spirit operates as a whole. many people, everybody seeking individual aims and their particular finite standpoint, just in virtue of interaction, are going to generate things that basically, if you have a finite willing, a particular willing, a natural willing, you will inevitably just generate things which are the opposite, because it just doesn't make sense to do that. Like, it's just contradictory. Spirit's kind of this thing that's like in between. It's like the resolver, right? It only lets things make sense. And so things that don't make sense just will dissolve and destroy themselves. And things that do make sense will harness and strengthen in a sort of way. And so that's kind of like Spirit play. It's like everybody's fiddles, strings, and instruments. Not in the sense that they're explicitly just a means, but in the sense that what you will is not necessarily what you meant. Willing is something more comprehensive in scope. Spirit takes the essence or the truth of things, so to speak. It doesn't let them remain just finite, or just myopic, or parochial, or just your personal point of view. It doesn't let that stuff stand.
Yeah, it's that famous phrase, truth hits everybody. And people are like, oh, well, that's not true. Well, actually, when you actually take a good look at reality and history, it is true. Evil and falsehood simply will not persist. They're in existence, they're blips that immediately cancel themselves as far as, from the God's eye view is concerned. To us, it seems, somebody goes on years and years and years and things seem so dysfunctional and so wrong. But the fact that they are dysfunctional and so wrong is precisely what the judgment of God is. That
yes,
things that are, precisely the things that are finite create their own opposition, which is exactly why they are dysfunctional, which is exactly why they are unhappy, which is exactly why they will inevitably change.
Yeah, it's like how I don't know, if somebody's a chronic liar, and it seems like they could hide it and they could just get all the benefits. But it's like, why does that even work? Like, if you just get all the people they know together and get them just talk about that person, it will unravel instantly. Like, there's no hiding. It's only hidden insofar as it's on an individual, like, this liar is lying to you specifically, and you don't talk to the other person, and you don't know the other people who they're also lying to. But if you get all those people together, they'll be like, they said that? Wait, they told me this. And then also, it's absurd. It's hilarious almost. Like, the lies just don't make sense. And it's like, no matter what's going on for people or many people, that's kind of how Spirit works too. It's like, Spirit's like if all those people got together and got to talk, except it's doing that whether or not you talk to each other or not.
Yeah, it happens at extremely slow scales. I mean, Hegel talks about that. He says, like, these things that we've got here have taken thousands of years for Spirit to work out. We despair over a couple decades, and he says, like, a couple decades historically are nothing.
Yeah. The slow grind of history.
And it was boy, that was a long tangent, but it was a good tangent. I wanted to go back to the thing about tyranny, despotism, and the thing you mentioned about how, like, the irony of tyranny is we say, oh, in tyranny or in despotism only one is free, but immediately Hegel shows, like, that's not even true. Nobody is free in tyranny. Nobody. This is why like the first chapter on China, and then the second chapter on India as well. Those are two forms of despotism. One of them is supremely centralized despotism of the Chinese emperor, in which the emperor, where it's given a human face in the emperor, but actually even the emperor is under these abstract rules, which, like as you said, nobody knows where they come from. It's said to be an edict of heaven, but nobody really knows, and everybody's caught up in this mechanical relationship to each other. The people aren't free; they don't recognize themselves in the state. And this is actually really important. This is why the despot isn't a king. He's not king neither by the will of the people. He's not their prince, so to say, nor by the will of God, because the emperors in China, they did have this thing called the mandate of heaven, which is kind of like the will of God. But then the emperors themselves also thought that there was a sort of mechanical relationship between heaven and themselves, where like, I do this and this and this, and you're supposed to give me this and this and this. And so there is a way in which the emperor had a mutual determination with heaven, but ultimately they themselves were always subsumed under the rules of just having this brutal regime, which was brutal not just for the poor, it was brutal for everybody. Everybody lived under just these strictures of rules and ways of life were just, from our standpoint, they just absolutely awful. Inhuman, quite frankly. Same thing with India, where like a lot of things were just like these strict rules that were just given, and everybody just lived under that pressure constantly. Even the people who
Right.
try to game it, like, couldn't get away from it.
So that makes sense to me. Can you tell me if this is like a rough approximation? Like, I'm just picturing like, all right, I'm this emperor, and I think me doing well in my kingdom is just obeying these laws of nature, these laws from the emptiness or the Tao, whatever. And it's like, I must flood the valley or something like that, even though there's farmland down there, so that there will be prosperity. And so I just flood the thing, and then it doesn't happen, and I'm like, oh, I'm doing wrong by the divine law. I have to do something else. And it's not, so I'm constantly reorienting myself, doing random shit, to appease this mechanism which is not in front of me or anything. It's just from behind me, and I just have to follow it out, and I'll get my end. And so I'm just it's like a pachinko machine. It's just like random ball. I'm just trying shit, and everybody's like, "We gotta do it!" Like, fuck.
Yeah, which is like the whole divination thing and the Confucian rules and piety and the connection of that to fate in heaven. And the thing about the emperor is that the emperor, like, the emperor is the state, even though Hegel doesn't consider China and that kind of relationship to be a state relationship. It's a proto-state relationship. He says China is just a pure administration. But nonetheless, like, the entirety of the state, all of it, every single bit is on the emperor. So, it's like you're putting reality on the weight of one person. Like, that person is a slave. Every little thing that goes wrong is your fault. If you're that person. Which is why everything was so heavy, like the consequences, like publicly, were heavy. Like, you couldn't get away with it, and if you try to get away with it, you wouldn't get away with it for long.
Jesus.
Yeah. So yeah, I can see how that would immediately lead to the opposite swing of democracy. But in democracy, Hegel, like, the democracy is really just a hidden thing for Hegel, where democracy isn't that everyone is equal or everyone is free. It's still it's a word, what for Hegel was a worse form of aristocracy. is it only some were free? Only the land-owning and free Athenians who weren't slaves were the ones who got to engage in democracy. And even then, the reason democracy got a really bad rap afterwards is thanks to what we got from Plato, where we got the story of Socrates, and we found out how a righteous person who was doing everything right got screwed by democracy because people were mad that he was telling them the truth. He was showing them up as ignorant.
I actually found the part in the Philosophy of Right where he gives, in brief, the outline of the four formations.
Oh, read it off.
All right, they're pretty short. I don't want to take up time here, but they're quite short. All right, section 353 of Ethical Life, the State of the Philosophy of Right. In its first and immediate revelation, mind has as its principle the shape of substantial mind, i.e., the shape of the identity in which individuality is absorbed in its essence, and its claims are not explicitly recognized. So that follows with what we were saying, where it doesn't have to make sense to you; it just happens. The second principle is this substantial mind endowed with knowledge, so that mind is both the positive content and filling of mind, and also the individual self-awareness, which is the living form of mind. The principle is ethical individuality as beauty. The third principle is the inward deepening.
So just
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense for Greece. And what he said before the ethical individuality, what was he said? Can you read that again, the little piece?
Yeah. The second principle is this substantial mind endowed with knowledge, so that mind is both the positive content and filling of mind, and also the individual self-awareness, which is the living form of mind. The principle is ethical individuality as beauty.
Okay. So the way I'm thinking about that is, he says it has knowledge, and it becomes aware of its own mediation. This is the moment of the for itself, where form as form takes precedence over all else. And then it would make perfect sense why democracy is the expression of that form of spirit. Because democracy is pure formality. It has no principles which it must adhere to. It's the will of the people, whatever that will might be.
That's interesting. All right. I want to move through the next two so that I have a sense of the overarching shape he's painting here. The third principle is the inward deepening of this individual self-awareness and knowledge until it reaches abstract universality and therefore infinite opposition to the objective world, which in the same process has become mind forsaken.
Right, that's religion, Christianity. It's the Christian world.
And then the principle of the fourth formation is the conversion of this opposition so that mind receives in its inner life its truth and concrete essence, while in objectivity it is at home and reconciled with itself. The mind has thus reverted to the substantiality with which it began, is the mind that has returned out of the infinite opposition, and which consequently engenders and knows this, its truth, as thought and as a world of actual laws.
Okay. Now that makes sense of something I've been actually Spearman talked a lot about, and I'm like, where the heck are you getting these? Because I never like looked deeply into it. Where he's talking about the aesthetic state and the religious state. The aesthetic state being Greece, the religious state being the medieval Christian kingdoms.
Whenever I read these things, I always have to sit with them for like half an hour before I can like pull like 2 solid sentences of my own thoughts out, and I can be like, I feel confident in saying those sentences.
Yeah, but interesting. I was not aware that it was a 4-part concept.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. Usually, one thing the thesis, antithesis, synthesis meme gets right is oftentimes it is 3. This time it's 4 though.
Yeah. Anyways, that was good. Let's keep going. We're halfway.
On
Detour.
page 60. Here, he says about 3/4 of the way down the page that the process of history appears to be an advance from the imperfect to the more perfect. There we have the developmental, progressive view of history we've been talking about. But in this transition from the imperfect to the more perfect, Hegel says that the imperfect stage is to be grasped as having the perfect within itself. The imperfect stages of history are internally driven by having a perfect stage of history implicit within them, in the same way that the seed of the oak tree has the oak tree implicit within it. And the sublation or synthesis is kind of a funny concept because it can mean both preservation and negation. So the tension between opposites is negated, right? It collapses, as we said, but it also is preserved. It had a partial truth to it that persists into the present. On page 60, Hegel talks about stages in the development of spirit. And he says that we first go from the immersion of spirit in natural life, right? So spirit is just completely implicit within nature, to a
Those would be China and India in the philosophy of history.
second stage, where spirit emerges into consciousness and freedom. But even that second stage of emerging into consciousness and freedom, gaining a certain reflective dimension, right? Spirit is able to reflect on itself, is not the end goal. Ultimately, these 2 moments, which we can even think about as the thesis and antithesis, get sublated into a 3rd stage, which is spirit in its universality. And
yes, for number 2, the self-conscious would be Greece, and then the Christian world. And then 3 would be
that would be what is it called? Not tetrad.
Yeah, it's a tetrad. Like it's a 4-part.
Oh, is tetrad the fourfold?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because depending on how you read the moment of mediation, you can potentially get like 2 readings there, and which then leads to the 4th, or it can just be you can treat that as just second, and then it goes to the 3rd.
Yep.
self-consciousness. Here, spirit unifies the subjective with the objective and becomes fully free. Now, here's where it gets pretty colonialist. Hegel talks about the...
Actually, just a point on Greece and the Christian world. Greece is the aesthetic state. The Christian world is the religious state. They're 2 inversions of the same mediation. Because the mediation of aesthetics is the conceptual in sensuous form, where the sensuous is a dominant expression of the conceptual. Yeah, in religion, it's the inversion. It's the conceptual as a dominant expression of the idea. There's still sensuality in it, but the conceptual side is far stronger. It's not completely overbearing, but it is far stronger. At least in religion, what appears is the notion that whatever the absolute is, it is in essence not something sensuous, but it still is presented in a slightly sensuous form. There's a whole story of God-men, supernatural stuff, but it's still happening in this world. And that's the final part of that tetrad is then the pure cleansing of that mediation with sensuality to no longer be a mediation between the purely conceptual or thought and the sensuous and natural, but a pure mediation of thought and thought. And let's see what she says about the colonialism.
Folk principles that I mentioned in my video for last week. The Volksgeist is the spirit of a people. Hegel says that spirit works through individual peoples at individual moments of time, such that certain civilizations have a world historical role to play before then passing away. So for instance, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had a historical role to play on the slaughter bench of history and its increasing self-actualization of spirit into the idea, but then eventually its time was up, it decayed, and then was gone. The Volksgeist, or national spirit, spirit of a people, is only a particular phase of world spirit, Hegel says on page 82. Individual civilizations culminate in a particular thought or notion, right? A particular civilization has a kind of lifespan, according to Hegel. It's born, it reaches maturity, and then it dies. And whatever essential thought or contribution the civilization had to make becomes the kernel of rebirth for the next civilization. Hegel likens this to the image of the phoenix. And he says that the image of the phoenix comes from Asia, but because Hegel is extremely Eurocentric, he thinks that literally the culmination of world history is in Prussia in his time of living. He says a Western version of the phoenix is better because it's not just that the phoenix is reborn, but the phoenix is reborn as a purer and more spiritual being. Page 76. For Hegel, what brings about...
We gotta pause that.
Yeah.
All right. It's funny because I was reading this today, the exact passages she's referring to in his philosophy of history. And, so, his point here is about the distinction between nature and spirit. This is not, it's not strictly a difference between the Oriental and the Occidental, per se. For him, it does happen to be. But, his point is that there's actually a concept at play here, which is, regarding this, life cycle image. There is the issue of basically you have this thing and it is set in its growth and it comes around and it closes with itself and it produces another, but this other is the same as it was. It's just a repetition, right? So it's a cycle that keeps repeating itself identically. And I think even his example of the phoenix, if I'm remembering right, is an Occidental example of the same. But his point is that spirit proper isn't just a repetition. It's not just this natural life cycle, even though it does play out in life cycles to some extent with respect to particular nations. But the point is that the life cycle of one nation, whatever is world spirit at the time, has transmitted the kernel of its principle to another, which takes it up in a different manner. So that it's not like the phoenix dies and is just perpetually reborn from its ashes, but that every time it does this, it self-modifies. The principle, or what it did, is retained and used as a basis for something which develops even further. So there's an ascension aspect. There is a progressive aspect. So that rather than just this natural loop, he reintroduces this line of progression, it seems, from what I can tell in his philosophy of history.
Yeah.
And he interestingly enough, regarding China. He actually says that that natural life cycle, that circle, is actually a profound point in the history of their thinking. Like, that's actually, he thinks it's one of the highest ideas present as a major principle in their civilization, is that this notion of this natural circle, this death becomes life, life becomes death, this circle of life and death. He thinks that that Ouroboros sort of thing is actually, like, that's a high idea for him, and he just thinks it belongs to nature, where spirit has this extra step where it does not simply loop upon itself and just keep repeating itself, it ascends continuously.
Yeah. I mean, to say something about the notion of colonialism here. I don't know why she brought it up. Well, maybe there's a minute left, but I don't know what she'll bring up that might be going into that.
Maybe we should listen to the next minute to see.
Actually, let's probably finish it.
Yeah, we only got one more minute. Might as well let her get her fucking critique out.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead and hit play.
The decline or death of a people is habit. Habit, or activity without opposition, just kind of going through the motions, are the first sign, according to him, that a people is in decline. And I'll just say that this progressivist view of history that Hegel offers, including its notion that history is forwarded by individual peoples, has a long and quite fraught legacy in subsequent philosophy. So, for instance, you can hear resonances here of what will later become National Socialist rhetoric in Germany, right? The idea that the German people have a world historical mission to play. And then on the other side of things, there's somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, who in the early 20th century in America says that Black people in the US are now the world historical people that Hegel envisioned. What do you think about this Hegelian legacy and his focus on the way that world spirit gets actualized through individual peoples? And what in general of the progressivist or teleological notion of history, that things are always getting better due to an immanent, intrinsic law within material conditions of the world?
I like the way she ended that with the open question, and there wasn't like a hint of sarcasm. She was just like, I'm throwing this question at you guys, my audience. What do you think? Like, I really think about it. Talk to each other about it. What do you think about this idea? I thought that was nice.
It wasn't,
because even though she was prefacing it with like there's colonial sketchiness with Hegel, she still treated him ultimately serious by doing that little gesture at the end, which I thought was nice.
Yeah, I thought that was like, I don't think this is a bad video. I think it could have been much better, especially with just like the middle portion about the dialectic stuff. Otherwise, just the first fourth of it, I thought it was just a presentational issue, that it seems, the way she presented it makes it seem a lot weirder than it actually is. And it's not that difficult to make it not weird. The stuff on history was not terrible. And that one I can definitely forgive, because the philosophy of history is an awful set of lectures to get into Hegel. It is just too difficult there to unravel what is actually conceptually going on. It's just
it's incredible that people think that's an introductory, or like let's get reading Hegel philosophy history. It's crazy to me that people start with that.
I suppose just to give some comments on the historical thing. As far as the progressive stuff goes, from the standpoint of Hegelianism, once you grasp what a concept is, this is not a question. It's not that maybe there's progress. There has been progress. This is absolutely certain. We know this because we can look back at history, see how very different portions of historical peoples, places, moments have instantiated certain kinds of understandings which are very clear and demarcated in conceptual terms, and how that leads through a chain of developments which are not always directly connected geographically. My own suspicion is that there's been a worldwide chain of communications throughout history, far deeper into history than we are even aware of, such that I'm not so sure that it's just like, oh, well, you know, there was despotism here, and at this other side of the world, an opposite idea of that also happened to arise at the same time, and there was no connection here, geographically speaking, on the material plane. I'm not entirely sure about that. But regardless of that, the logical progression of principles is clear. Is it a complete and utter progress all the way? Well, no. I mean, and Hegel's pretty open about this. He says, like, what empirically, there's slowdowns, there's stops. Yeah, sometimes like certain developments just stop for a long time. Like in philosophy, for example. He doesn't like the medieval scholastics very much, and he says, like, you know, that was like a stopgap of like 500 years where like philosophy stopped. So various parts of historical developments can stall, and sometimes, you know, and we know, at least in some cases, like there were regressions. You know, we lost knowledge for sure. So that's possible, but nonetheless, still the long-term developments have been progressive. Second is the thing about the colonial mindset. Depending on what one means, whether like, because there's the old notion of empire, and there's like the modern notions of empires, of which we have two. There's like, you know, the empire in the sense of like the British empires, which were these, and well, not just the British, but the European empires that went out and pillaged the world. And even those two didn't function the same. You know, like there was the British form of that, which was highly genocidal, racist, and rapacious. And then there were other powers like Spain, which were rapacious, but were not genocidal in the biological sense, and they weren't racist in that. They were racist, but not anywhere near as far as Britain was. And so there was a sense in which, like, they did colonize the people, but they really colonized them. They culturally integrated them into the fold. You know, which is why, you know, Mexico is kind of like a place that's not exactly clear of racism, but the issues are not as big as, say, in the United States, because there was a huge intermix of the races in Mexico. You know, Spaniards and the Indians came together. They came together not just like, oh, well, you know, marriages and whatnot and children, but due to the, what would be the term for this? The forcefulness of the colonization project, which went beyond just simply, you know, forcing people into a material labor force, but also enforced a new ideology, a new religion, etc. There was a capacity to have these people integrate into the future, which has happened.
Yeah, Catholicism got fucking picked right up, didn't it?
Yeah, it's huge. And part of it is just because that's precisely how Catholicism was designed. You know, Catholicism didn't just erase the prior religions. You know, it wanted to, but it recognized that it had to take on a kind of image to get the transference to stick. So there's plenty of things in which, like, saints and gods and idols of the Indians that are like, oh, who you're really talking about is Jesus. Who you're really talking about is Mother Mary. And the Indians like, oh, okay, well, you know, we'll just call it Jesus, Mother Mary, and, you know, you'll say your Hail Marys and use your rosaries. And they kept on doing a lot of what they used to do, but now it's under the Catholic veil. You know?
Right. It's interesting because, from what I can tell, that, if it was even tried, and I don't think it was, failed horribly in Canada, and certainly throughout parts of the United States. I'm less educated on the United States, where to this day, there's just this brutal incommensurability for Indigenous people in Canada, and Canada as, you know, colonials, like a state that was established colonially. Like, it is really hard to actually look at the current situation and see some kind of path to integration. That's really hard. Yeah.
Definitely. Part of the success of the Spaniards' conquest and the Portuguese conquest is precisely because, like, they were so forceful. Like, there was just no escape. You know, there was a forced integration in material terms and a forced integration on ideological terms. So eventually, just like, you know, there just isn't much difference. You know, people look like each other. People speak the same language. People live with each other, work with each other, and they go to the same goddamn churches. So it's hard to then just treat those people as aliens, or, you know, for them to be alienated in that way. And that's how the old empires kind of functioned anyways. You know, like the Roman Empire, that's part of its success strategy, was that it integrated peoples by not requiring like such a full integration, but nonetheless there was enough integration that things could hold together. So my point about that is like her thing about like there's world historical peoples. That this is the case is without it. It's just empirically the case. You know, if you don't like the logic of it, like, you at least can't deny empirically this was the case. That whether you think that it was mandated by reason or whether it was just a happenstance thing, nonetheless there have been and are to this very day groups of people of geographic concerns and nationalities and whatnot who have an inordinate amount of influence on the developments of the rest of the world, as is to be understood. You know, for a while it was Britain. You know, after Britain, it's the U.S. and it's only in one certain sense, by the way, right? Like, for example, she talks about the historical, you know, the Nazis and the Germans. You don't even have to go to the Nazis. Even before that, it is a historical fact that the German people can be said legitimately to have had a world historical significance and mission, because, my God, the modern world intellectually is a German creation. Our science,
it's pretty insane.
Science.
That's really an important thing. Where I think or in the video, it's expressed that, like, the things that aren't good examples of Hegel being a colonial person are chosen. Like, the absurd, like, it's almost absurd, the level of influence Germany or Western thought has had on the world. It's ridiculous. We're living in a ridiculously Western modernity currently.
Yeah,
it's just undeniable. There's no point in... That's not a colonial thing to say. That's a fact. It's a fact that doesn't matter where you live on Earth, you're pretty much heavily bombarded with, like, right now, the United States, and has been for a long time. Everybody has been trying to be like the United States for a long time, and if you didn't, you were languishing, basically. That's just a fact. There's just really, like, there's more obvious things you can point out for Hegel. Like, Hegel will just say, like, the new world's ours. He'll say shit like that. Or there's very blatant racist or colonialist things that Hegel says, and like, but the point that like Germanic culture has not been astonishingly and profoundly influential on the world is not the right point to pick at. Because the fact of the matter is that throughout history, there's continually been dominant civilizations that have been the exporters of ideas and things and activities and ways of organizing things. That's just how it works. When there's something that's effective, like profoundly effective, you pick it up and then you get to keep pace and maybe outpace eventually when you come up with something else that is more effective. But if you don't, you languish. Just acknowledging just basic that what is effective will lead you to a conclusion that there is pretty continuously world-dominating civilizations or cultures. It just happens.
Yeah, and Hegel calls it the slaughter bench of history for a reason. He doesn't think that this has any necessity to look like anything wonderfully nice in the immediate picture or even in the overall picture. For many things, there's many times in which like something can be in advance. It cannot be horrid. Like for example, Christianity. The ideas of Christianity, logically speaking, were absolutely necessary and are so key to the modern world. It's not just the modern Western world. The whole world is Western, as you said. From the U.S. to China, these ideas have shaped it. Like, even in China, where, there's a bit of a rise of nationalism, that is still a Western influence nationalism now. In India, that's still a Western influence India now. There is no going back. The idea like to decolonialize culturally is impossible because the modern world and the very idea of decolonization is a Western idea.
It is, yeah. That's another interesting thing, which is, as kind of a side note, and this is just like a minor grouse or gripe about just an aspect of some progressive politics where it's like LGBT rights and like lots of things like that. Those came like right out of the West, especially in their current form, and to the extent and depth and breadth that they possess now, and like the intellectual elaboration of them, uniquely Western. Like, it's not like it's unprecedented. Like in Aboriginal peoples, you have like two spirits and like stuff like that, but like the kind of significance it's taken on, and just the manifold of thinking, specific notions, and like all kinds of very specific notions on how to address that and respect that and things, like they're very Western. As you said, decolonization is like a Western thing.
Even now, like, even if it, which I think this is happening, there's a shifting towards the east. China. Some people say Russia. I don't think Russia's very ideologically poised right now for much of anything. Even the people who think that it's significant don't think that it's that much of a significance, though it is significant to a certain extent. Even those, what people are looking towards in China is not something alien to the West. I mean, China is the modern, current day China is already Westernly infused China with certain kind of Western ideas, tailored towards a Chinese Eastern flavor. There's a temperance of things. Insofar as the rest of the world starts looking towards China and starts, taking a few things from China here and there, people say, Hegel was wrong. the East is finally the place where history ends. Well, it doesn't matter anymore. Like, they're like, in a distinct sense, since the whole world is Western, the West doesn't make any sense anymore as the West, It is now a global culture, which has no limitation to any region whatsoever, and it's now the provenance, literally, of the entire peoples of the world. It's now the heritage of everybody, not just of the Anglos, not just the French, not just the Germans. It's everybody now.
This is something I've been thinking about recently, which is so a lot of the past century in a lot of continental philosophy has been a very lengthy criticism of capitalism as a whole, and just a lot of it is consistent in penetrating into the way in which it infects life, or it dominates life, like the way capital just dominates life. And what's interesting here is that you can take basically a tremendous amount of these points, and you can invert them and say that's universality. This thing that can't be beaten, this thing where it's like a hydra where you try and cut off one head and two more spring up. You try and rebel and that gets turned into commodity, and so on and so forth. Like endless. You can point this out endlessly. This kind of, I can't outmove this thing because any move I make is instantly grasped and taken into it. That's what universality kind of looks like, actually. And the way in which capital has managed to globalize, unhindered, it's impossible to resist. It's impossible to resist it. It's the same reason why I hate to say it, but why do countries make sweatshops? It's because you make more money if you make sweatshops, and people who are doing all kinds of awful work, they make a bit more money at a sweatshop, and a company's going to invest all that stuff because there's cheap labor and all that. That is all, and it's almost involuntary. It's the way it's United States is let's protect U.S. manufacturing and stuff, but they can't because companies are just no, it's cheaper over here, and they go, and then that country gets enriched and they have to move somewhere else, and then that country starts moving to the service industry, and that whole process of, it's like an octopus that's gradually laying out its tentacles, and it's lifting up corals as it moves out and stuff like that. And it's often it's kind of it feels honestly like a kind of a grotesque argument to make, but it's just a fact that capitalism unjudgmentally, uncapriciously modernizes, updates, brings everyone in the fold, and it does this in a way that's kind of whether you like it or not, but it's gonna bring you, and it does that. It's it's like a complex. It's like world spirit giving a big group hug, and it's not necessarily a nice hug. It's a complicated hug,
yeah.
But everybody is 2 feet taller by the end, and it's just what happened. And it's like continental criticism has been I feel radical. Here's how capital is getting into our lives, man, and it's fucking us up, man, on all these levels. And it's that's because it doesn't care about you in particular. It's doing something bigger than anyone in particular, and it's people who ride the wave better are going to benefit more, as many Western nations have successfully done so far. But at the same time, it's not going to stay with them if they fuck up, and it's going to go somewhere else if they know what to do. It's that kind of it's like catching a wave. Everyone's trying to catch the wave. The wave does not care, but those who ride the wave best soar, and they spray in the sunlight, and there's a rainbow. That's what it does, and honestly, that's kind of what spirit looks like to me in Hegel. There's a serious analogy between the organicism of capital and the way spirit is in Hegel, and what universality actually looks like, because universality isn't pleasant from any kind of a you as an individual standpoint or any kind of you as even a particular nation standpoint. It really is a there's a religious element there where it's like you aren't just looking at yourself, you're not looking at your country, you're looking at everything. And on the whole, it makes sense. It does not make sense if you restrict your vantage point.
Yeah, and that's the example of capital is extreme, and yet it's fitting, precisely because of that unstoppable universality. And this is why Marx praises it, and Marx recognizes as well. He says, like, capital melts all that is solid into air, but he recognizes, it's like it's destroying traditionalism. It makes it impossible to remain there. It forces an interconnection of the globe. It makes everything fluid by the unstoppable progress of its technological innovation, because it itself cannot rest on its laurels. Unlike slavery, unlike other forms of life before, where you could go like, well, this is good enough, I'm satisfied, that's it. A business cannot do that. Businesses will die if they do that. They cannot stop. There is an impetus that somebody somewhere is going to have an aha moment, an invention that's going to put you out on the streets. And it doesn't matter how nice you were up for your workers, doesn't matter how good you were to your community, you're going to go out of business. And as a business, your job is to remain as a business. You're not a charity, you're not an NGO, so you're forced into the rat game. And it's precisely that force that nobody can stop, nobody can control. There is no law that can be given by state, nothing. It's impossible. And the thing about the analogy of the wave is very apt. And it's not, and you're right, it's not just for capital, it can be said of that for spirit in general, where ideally we want to reach a point in which we are aware. We become conscious, because the problem with capital, as Marx says, is unconscious. Now you look at China. China's very conscious about its unconscious capitalism, which is why they managed to harness its power so greatly. The condensed, although if you look at it also, we all are aware of the condensed human suffering that it took to do that. But if you compare that to the entire history of the suffering in China, that moment of about, 50 years, in which people were just ground up in the grinder of soulless factory works, sweat labor work, all for under the promise that this is all building something greater, and people continued to do so. They bore through that soul crushing moment of history, 50 years. Because as they were doing it, they kept getting glimpses that indeed there was something good coming, and it was coming down in trickles, little by little, but it was coming. So they bore through it. This is a harsh reality, not just of capitalism, it's a harsh reality of spirit. People don't take it seriously. Hegel says, phenomenology of spirit is the highway of despair, and they think it's just an intellectual despair. It's not. It's not just an intellectual despair. It's also the real despair of of existing in this world, of what it is to be the kind of being that we are. That even at the point in which we think that we get to that point, we're like, I finally understood it all. No, you haven't. What you said earlier about the intent and the truth of the will. We may intend something, and we may believe that we know all the factors. It's guaranteed that this is never going to be the case, ever. Too many factors are out of our hands. Whatever we might intend, other things will come about. no empire. Rome did not intend to fall apart. Nonetheless, its own internal trajectory just brought it to be that way, along with its conditions. The U.S. didn't intend to go from a world empire. I mean, this has got to be the shortest-lived world empire. We dominated for what, 60 years? And out of those 60 years, we only were the top dog, like unquestioned, for what, 20 years? And we had statesmen who had an understanding of policies, whatever, and our politicians have gotten just more and more stupid. Now, is this like some kind of intention we had? No. All of this, is unintended. But it is a consequence of what we have done, which was inexorably in what we are, as the societies that we are. But anyways, I don't know if you have any other further closing remarks. We've been going on for a little bit more than 2 hours, which was exactly what I thought it would be. But this was good. I thought we made a lot better points than I had expected we would make, and we definitely had a lot more. Well, we had about as much to say as I thought we would say.
Yeah, I was surprised. I thought I was just gonna be watch a video and have a few comments here or there. I didn't expect to actually end up rambling, but I did.
But all right, for those of you listening, hope you enjoyed it. I think this was elucidating on some things, and also just a good show of Hegelian erudition on our part. But all right, see you around.